Hello, everybody, and it's good to be with you this Thursday. And I want to continue talking about our study book, which is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I wanted to be dealing with chapter 6 this week. It's a chapter on, let me double check, I think it's chapter 6. Yes, it is. The one on the book of Acts. Very good chapter, and I encourage you to read it. I can summarize it, and I will summarize it for you to some extent. And I'm going to add some other, some more material, I guess, to help you understand a little bit more about what's going on with Acts. Now, remember, this book really is a beginning study. So I'm going to advance you just a little bit beyond this chapter on Acts, just because for our movement, the Restoration Movement, in fact, most people don't call us the Restoration Movement anymore. Even the Restoration Movement scholars no longer refer to us that way. We prefer to be called the Stone Campbell Movement, just because the idea of restoration stemming from the book of Acts, the idea that we can restore the ancient church back to its proper order that's presented to us in Acts is just not possible, because Acts does not give us a standardized picture of the church community. Now, that may be disconcerting to some. However, you need to read Acts more carefully and try to understand what is going on with that book. And with what I'm getting ready to share, hopefully it will be even more helpful along with the reading in the book. Now, the book of Acts is a historical book. That's the first thing we have to understand. It is the historical book of the New Testament. Now, yes, the Gospels are historical, and I will talk about the Gospels next week, and we will be referring to them as historical biographies, so they are also historical writings. So Acts, in a sense, is the historical setting for the early Christian movement in the first century in the Greco-Roman Empire around the Mediterranean area, basically, is what we're talking about. It's very interesting how the book of Acts is laid out. So it is a movement. It's presenting a story from chapter 1 to chapter 28. It is presenting a larger narrative. If you remember last week, I called that a meta-narrative. Meta-narrative. So it is offering this larger narrative, or a meta-narrative, within Acts itself. And it's trying to show how, for Theophilus, because it seems like, I should back up, Luke, the Gospel of Luke and Acts seem to go together. They seem to be two volumes dedicated to the same person, this Theophilus. And this is the historical recounting of how the message of salvation through Jesus Christ went from Jerusalem and made it to Rome. That's basically what the story is telling us. Now, the way that it's laid out is quite interesting. And if you think about Acts, basically the first half of the book of Acts concerns the ministry of Peter. The second half of Acts basically concerns the ministry of Paul. Those are the main characters in those sections. Yes, we have other things going on. So, for instance, in the first half with Peter's ministry, you have Philip, and you have John, and you have, Agabus, and some other characters, some minor characters. But the main person is Peter. In the latter half, the main person is Paul, but you have other people. You have Barnabas, you have Silas, you have Timothy, and so forth. So, we have these other characters, but the main character in that latter half is Paul himself. So it's almost as if the first half of Acts is dedicated to the Apostle Peter, and the second half is dedicated to the Apostle Paul. Now, the writing itself, from chapter 1 to chapter 28, has to cover at least 25 years of time. Maybe 30. Probably more into 30 years of time. There is a large amount of time presented within Acts. We do not have every instance of whatever is going on in Acts. We barely have anything, to tell you the truth. We only have what, I'm assuming Luke wanted to give us under the direction of the Holy Spirit. That's all we have. There are great chunks of information that we just don't have. In fact, Paul's recollection of his ministry adventures seems to be a little bit off on what's going on for some reason, or maybe we're misunderstanding how Paul's relaying the information. than what's going on in Acts. But regardless, I still think Acts is the book to go to as far as understanding the historical movement of these people in this beginning Christian movement in the first century in the Greco-Roman Empire. Now, since this book, these 28 chapters, cover such a large span of time, we have to understand that the author or the narrator only wants to give us the material that that person seems to be seems pertinent for us. So there could be a large span of time in between events. You know, we often talk about people moving from place to place. Well, they're moving, but they're doing it by foot, so it's taking them a long time. But there are lots of things going on that just aren't told to us. For instance, the problem that occurs in Galatia between Peter and Paul and some of the Judaizers from Jerusalem does not seem to occur in the book of Acts, but we do have this conference. It seems to be a result of this encounter. So it's odd how Luke puts Acts together. It is chronological. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you're working through time as it progresses through, some medium. It's time. I mean, it's one day, then the next day, so forth. So it's not like he's moving events around in order to be thematic. He's doing it chronologically, but he is very choosy in what he gives us, and it is very sparse. So there's a lot of information that we can insert within just from knowing the history around the times, or even having a good recollection of Paul's ministry and how he presents it in his letters. And you could also figure out some things from like 1 Peter. 1 Peter, I think, does have some important information that would be useful for putting some things together in Acts. But there are other places to go that we can use, definitely. Now, as I said before, it is a historical narrative. Acts is a historical narrative. So it seems to be presenting the movement. So it begins in Jerusalem. In fact, you think about Luke, because Luke and Acts go together. So for Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, it is how does the gospel get to Jerusalem? So it doesn't begin in Jerusalem. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, there's this phrase that comes up in chapter 9, and I think it's in verse 56 or something like that, 57. But anyway, it says, Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. And from that point on in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem. So the Gospel of Luke is trying to tell us how the gospel message, or how Jesus got to Jerusalem. And then Acts picks up. Now this is after the resurrection. Acts, after the resurrection, we find out how the message of salvation through Jesus Christ made it from Jerusalem to Rome. Now, it is a narrative, so we have to be careful how we look at it. So the Acts book itself is a larger narrative, and then there are smaller narratives within Acts itself. Many, many narratives. So we're still using the same principles that I talked about last week. There will be characters, there will be a story, a plot, there'll be tension, and there'll be resolution of that tension. There'll be a time element. If it's presented, it's important. A setting element is important. For instance, if Paul is preaching in a synagogue versus a marketplace or something like that, that's different. Paul preaching in Athens, these are significant. So some of the settings are very, very important, and time can also be important. Also, I think this is probably critical, more critical in Acts than in many other places, but the speech within Acts itself. The great speeches. In fact, I think Stephen's speech is probably the pinnacle. I think it is the elite speech within the book of Acts itself. There are 7 dominant speeches throughout Acts. In fact, my students used to ask me about preaching through Acts, and I said I would not preach through Acts chapter 1 to chapter 28. I wouldn't. There's just a lot of background information, historical information, that is very useful. It's useful for other places, but it's not useful for preaching a sermon. However, the speeches are, because that is where the instruction happens. Or to say it, that is where the exhortation happens. So you could preach these 7 great speeches. So you could do a great 7-part series upon the book of Acts itself. But that's all you need to do. You don't need to do all of that historical background information at all. In fact, and as I said before, I treat it as a narrative. I'd always keep the larger narrative in perspective, but realizing that these smaller narratives are building a progression of thought, let's put it that way, of how this is occurring in the meta-narrative. So these mini-narratives add up and are very, very useful for understanding Acts itself. Now, as I said, Acts is a writing that is a chronological progression. What I mean is Acts 2 happens after chapter 1, so time occurs, and then you have chapter 2, and so forth and so on. We can keep on going down the line. So there is that. It is chronological. However, it is sparsely detailed. We just don't have a lot of information within Acts itself. But what we do have is highly useful. Now, in chapter 1, verse 8, some people think that presents the structure to the book of Acts. And that's the part where Jesus says, I want you to stay in Jerusalem until the power of the Spirit comes, and then you'll take the message to Jerusalem, then you'll take it into Judea, then you'll take it into Samaria, and you'll take it into the other parts of the earth. And they try to divide Acts into like this 4-stage progression of the movement of the gospel. However, there's a huge problem with that approach. First thing is this. We don't really even have any kind of ministry that is any effort in Judea. Maybe there's a slight implication, but there's not much material going on, if any, in this region of Judea. So if it's so important, if it's part of the structure, then shouldn't it be mentioned? You think it should be. And then the uttermost parts of the earth is not a reference to Rome. I am sorry. In the Greco-Roman world, or the Roman Empire, Rome is the center of the empire. For them, it's the center of the world. So this is not the uttermost parts of the earth at all. In fact, at this time, the Roman Empire had discovered many areas that are far beyond the city of Rome. For instance, we know even in the letter of Romans that Paul's aware of a place called Spain. Well, that's west of Rome, a long ways west. And we know that in the first century, for instance, that the Roman Empire had found Britain. So they're even farther west. And then also farther north, they knew about the Germanic tribes. So they knew about India. There are lots of other places that these people would have known about. Rome is not the uttermost parts of the earth. I think this is a failed approach to the way that Acts is laid out. I think it's better to see Acts as a 2-part saga, basically. Now, again, the meta-narrative is how the gospel message, or how the good news of salvation through Christ went from Jerusalem to Rome. However, it seems to be a 2-part saga. So the first part, chapters 1 through 12. So chapters 1 through 12 seem to be mainly associated with the ministry of Peter. You're reading through chapters 1 through 12, we basically have it's basically Peter. It's interesting, in chapter 9, we have the introduction of Paul. And so there seems to be overlap going on here with Peter, and there'll be overlap with Peter and Paul's ministry. But for the first part, basically 1 through 12, the main person is Peter. Another interesting thing I think about the book of Acts is that after chapter 8, John drops off the map. We don't know what happens to that guy. He's just gone. But early on, Peter and John are working together, and then John's gone. It's kind of like Paul and Barnabas working together, then Barnabas is gone later. But regardless, it seems like in chapters 9 through 15, what we have is overlap material where we have Peter doing things, Paul doing things, and basically up to chapter 12, Peter, it seems to be the main character, and then after chapter 12, chapter 13 on, it seems to be Paul. But we still have Peter showing up in chapter 15, for instance, or we have Paul showing up in chapter 9 and chapter 10. There's some interaction going on there with Paul also. So my point being is that we almost have like a giant Venn diagram, and in the middle we have this overlap between Peter's ministry and Paul's ministry. So Acts 1 through 12 is basically Peter. 13 through 28 is basically Paul. From chapters 9 through 15 we have overlap going on, and that's basically what's going on. It seems that Luke's purpose is to present the ministry of the Apostle Paul as equal to the ministry of Peter. That's what it seems to be. He seems to be promoting. Now, everybody would have thought of Peter as being prominent. They knew where he was at as far as positioning, and he was with Jesus. He was one of Jesus' favorites. He was heavily involved in Jesus' ministry. So everybody would have known that he would be prominent. But Paul, he persecuted Christians. He came out of nowhere as being a fantastic zealot for the Christian movement after he met the Lord in chapter 9 of Acts. So it's almost as if Luke is promoting Paul as being just as significant as Peter. Now, I will say this quickly in reference to the Apostle Paul. Think about our New Testament without the Apostle Paul. Peter didn't write very much. Apostle Paul wrote a lot. We probably would not have a Christianity as we know it without Paul's writing. It would be something different. I don't know what it would be. I think Paul was probably the best teacher that we have in the New Testament. So if anything, I think Christianity would probably be a little bit more lacking in substance and lacking in that Old Testament grounding that it needs, that Paul gave to us. Paul was the best teacher. He was the best student also. So it would not be the same. We would not have the Gospel of Luke without the Apostle Paul. There's just not any way. Even though Luke says he went out and gathered stories from eyewitnesses, I mean, in it, obviously Luke has been with Paul, and Paul has imprinted upon him theological perspectives. Let's put it that way, for sure. So my point being is that I do think Paul is as prominent as Peter. In fact, I think probably Paul has somewhat more prominence than Peter as far as regard of material that's produced. Obviously, Paul has given us much more material. I can't imagine the book of Hebrews. Whoever wrote Hebrews? It wasn't Paul. It wasn't even an apostle. It was a second-generation Christian. We know that from chapter 2, verse 4. It's very, very clear. It came from a second-person generation or a second-generation Christian. However, that person was heavily influenced by the Apostle Paul. He doesn't use the same sort of argumentation, but he uses a similar methodology. Let's put it that way. The way that he weaves the Old Testament in to substantiate his arguments is just like Paul, who is also rhetorically trained. So these two, the writer of Hebrews and the writer of Paul, well educated, able to use rhetoric very well. I'm digressing. Let me get back to Acts real quick. Now, I talked about some of the similarities. So let me give you some ideas real quick, or let me show you how we have this two-part comparison going on. Now, you have to think beyond just a simple chapter or paragraph. In fact, I want to urge you to expand your reading to read the entirety of a book. So read the entire book of Acts on its own and begin to think about stuff that's going on. Now, it's a two-part saga. First part is about Peter. Second part's about Paul. There are mirroring ministry activities. Let me repeat that. There are mirroring ministry activities. Let me give you some examples. In Acts chapter 2, we have Peter's great speech. In that speech, he uses Psalm 110 and Psalm 16. And his purpose is to preach about the resurrection of Christ. Acts 13. Paul uses Psalm 2 and Psalm 16. In fact, both of them, Peter and Paul, use Psalm 16, verse 10. You will not let your Holy One see corruption or experience corruption, is what it says. It's the only place it's used in the entire New Testament. These two use it in speeches that are very, very similar. Psalm 1:2 and Psalm 110 are both royal psalms, so they're very, very similar in the messaging that they have. In fact, they are often connected with a hopeful messianic person, that kind of idea. So, and Paul also argues from the resurrection of Christ, and both of them are in front of Jewish people. So we have these similar sermons, Acts 2 and Acts 13. Chapter 3, Peter heals a lame person. Well, guess what? Chapter 14. Now remember, Paul's ministry is starting in chapter 13. Peter's is starting in chapter 1. So we're working through, and it's almost like it's mirroring on the other side. Chapter 14, guess what? Paul heals a lame person. Chapter 4. Peter has to defend his ministry before the Sanhedrin. This one is a little bit off, but we have in chapter 23, Paul has to defend his ministry before the Sanhedrin. Also, in chapter 9, Peter resurrects a young girl. Well, chapter 20, Paul resurrects a young man. In chapter 12, Peter has a miraculous prison break. In chapter 16, guess what? Paul has a miraculous prison break. Chapters 1 through 8 of Acts, we have Peter and John basically working together. We don't even know about any of the other apostles after chapter 2. They just vanish. We have no idea except John. Peter and John seem to work together up to chapter 8. After that, John disappears. He's gone. Chapter 13 and 14, guess what? We have Paul and Barnabas working together. So we have we have pairings gone. Yes, Paul goes on and works with Silas, true. But we have this great ministry effort by Paul and Barnabas. And Barnabas is someone of prominence. In fact, Barnabas is also called an apostle in the letter of Galatians. So, now he's not one of the original 12, obviously, but my point is that he has prominence, much like John. So we have this mirroring ministry activity going on throughout the book of Acts. Let me give you some guidelines about reading the book of Acts. First one is this. This is going to be hard for some people to understand. You just need to think about it, and you need to read through the book of Acts. Again, Acts does not prescribe activities to us. It only describes actions. It is not telling us how to do things. It's only telling us how things were done. That's all it's doing. In fact, we have no standardized church model presented to us in Acts. Not at all. We cannot restore. In fact, I think a lot of people got sidetracked on the restoration movement, thinking we were restoring back to this concept. Usually in the second generation of a restoration movement, or in some kind of a movement, things start to go awry. That's when things kind of went off kilter for the Stone Campbell movement. Let me put it that way. That's what everyone wants it to be called now, because they know that this idea of a restoration and presented in Acts 20, or in Acts the writing, is it's not there. There is no standardized structure for a church at all. And so we prefer to be called the Stone Campbell movement, which really started with the concept of unity. Must remember that. That was the concept. Bring people together. And the idea was that if we all sat down and read Scripture together, that we would come to similar conclusions. We would work towards unity. We would fulfill the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17. So, you cannot restore, okay? Because there's just not this standardized structure of a church in Acts. There's just not there. So, for instance, you could really go over stringent on this easily. If you lack wisdom, let's put it that way. If you lack wisdom, of course, you're going to come to some wrong conclusions over a narrative style of writing. Again, it's only telling us, let me repeat this again, it's only telling us how things were done. It is not telling us how to do things necessarily, except, now here's where I put my except clause, and I was going to bring this up later. And I've already talked about it. Except where there is exhortation. Where there is exhortation, speeches, sermons in Acts, we have exhortation. Where we have those portions of exhortation, then we do have material that we can instruct from. But other than that, it's not describing or prescribing anything to us. It's just only describing movement, and that's about it. So for instance, we don't have to have Acts chapter 2, they're praying in an upper room. I'm sure you could take this too far and think that every church has to have an upper room as a prayer room. Well, no, we don't have to do that. It just happens that they're praying in this upper room in the temple area. That's all it is. In fact, they are praying in the temple area. So do we have to go back to the temple area to pray? No, we don't. A little bit of wisdom will help you a great deal in working through the book of Acts. Acts 15, we have this grand conference where all Christian leaders come together over this problem of circumcision and the Gentiles' inclusion into this new covenant and some of the other things. If we have some kind of theological problem, do we have to make a big conference meeting again? Yes, the early church had many councils that got together. I don't agree with that concept, but my point being is that we don't have to have this kind of setup. If you were trying to restore, then you would want to restore that. And I just don't think that's something that we need to pursue. So I guess somebody could make an argument for street preaching versus, institutionalized church settings. In the book of Acts, we just have people preaching in the street. Well, again, a little bit of wisdom is going to carry you a long ways. That's not what it's prescribing for us to do. It's only describing what happened. It wouldn't matter if you did it a different way. It's only going to describe how things are being done. Now, Acts has been misused. There's just no doubt about it. Over and over, it has been misused. I'll give you 2 examples just from our heritage. Acts chapter 6. Now, not very many people will argue this in my lifetime anymore because it's such a bad argument from many, many viewpoints. Is Acts 6 and the work of deacons. And so, for one thing, the word diakonos in the Greek, I have to go back and look at it, but it's not. I don't even think it shows up. It's just the verb, diakoneo, is the only thing that shows up. It's just a very, very general word. There's nothing there, guys. All it means is to serve. That's all it means. It's a simple situation where the apostles are being overwhelmed and they just needed help. So they asked for these people to serve. It has nothing to do with our modern day idea of deacons. And another thing, if you just did an astute reading of Luke, or not Luke, but Acts, I'm sorry, you'd come to some really interesting conclusions. For instance, elders are not mentioned until chapter 11 of Acts. Why would anyone, and I don't think Acts chapter 6 is talking about deacons, but if you're arguing that, why would you mention something about deacons before you ever mention something about elders? It wouldn't make any sense, logical progression as far as having some kind of a ministerial structure for a church. It's just not there. Acts chapter 6 is not telling us anything about these. In fact, Stephen and Philip goes on to be evangelists, whatever that's supposed to mean. Both of them are doing miracles. So this is just not what Acts chapter 6 is trying to do. Acts chapter 20 has been misused by some people to state that we can only have communion on Sundays. That is not what Acts chapter 20 verse 7 is trying to say at all. It's just telling us what was going on at that time in Paul's ministry. That's all it's trying to say. In fact, the NIV really got us off track on Acts chapter 20 verse 7. So if you don't know the Greek and you're using NIV, you need to look at some other translations. Then it's going to start. Some questions are going to start coming to you. Like my NIV translation seems to be much stronger than some of these other translations. Well, why is that so? I'll tell you why. Because the NIV has stated that they've just put too much theology into that portion of Acts 20 for some reason. I don't know why, but it's severely mistranslated. There's a lot of places where Acts has been misused. We want to be careful not to misuse it. So the useful parts of Acts are the speeches or sermons. So again, let me tell you, students often ask me about Acts. I never taught Acts at St. Louis Christian College. It was a lower level class, so I didn't teach it. President Stein taught it. I taught the higher level Bible study classes. But I'd always tell people after they come out of Acts, they do that in the sophomore year, and then I generally would have access to students in junior year, so forth and so on, for the upper level classes. But what they would often ask me is, how would you use Acts, in your ministry? And I'd say I'd use very little material from Acts. I would only work on the speeches parts, because that is where the exhortation happens. What I mean by exhortation is instruction about Christian behavior or salvation, structure or information that's important for Christian lifestyle. Let's put it that way. Christian salvation, lifestyle, so forth and so on. So I would really concentrate on the speeches. There are 7 that are really prominent throughout the book of Acts. I would focus on those and those only, and use the rest of Acts as a historical background for other material that's going on in the rest of the New Testament. So for instance, you want to know about, you're reading through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you want to know about Thessalonica. Go to Acts chapter 17, read about what was going on in Paul's ministry in Thessalonica. Very good historical information to help you out as far as understanding what's going on in certain areas. You want to know about Corinth, Ephesus, so forth and so on. Acts has those accounts. It's very good for historical background. However, just realize that you don't have all of the picture. In fact, history as a whole, guys, you need to understand is that history can never be told in an absolute way. It just doesn't work that way. You're always saying, or you're always reliving the experience of someone as they experience that perspective. So they're seeing it one way, and they're sharing that perspective. You need to get other viewpoints in order to understand something. Let me give you a good example. And I'm not using this to advocate for, this is not advocacy for what was going on in the American South during the Civil War. I abhor that kind of behavior. But But most of our historical books, and I'm not promoting, and I'm not, please don't misunderstand me. I am not trying to promote the South's way of lifestyle. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. But it would be interesting to read historical perspectives from Southern historians. We don't really get that kind of perspective because generally the old adage is true: the winners write the historical books. And so, yes, just understand there are always other viewpoints out there. You'll never have an absolute view of history. So you'll always be learning about history. You never know the whole picture. Let's put it that way. There's much, much more to the historical background of the first century, what's going on in that Mediterranean area. But Acts gives us a lot of good information that can be used with lots of other information. So I would highly recommend that you use it to understand other books of the Bible. So let me just sum up some things real quick, and I can do it in one statement real quickly as you're reading through the book of Acts, or a couple ideas. Understand Acts is a historical narrative, so you use narrative methodological principles of interpreting or reading. So you have characters and storyline, and you have plot, tension, and resolution of some kind of problem. You have speech, time setting. You have all those interesting parts to consider as you're looking through Acts itself. Speeches are going to be very, very important in Acts. That's where you're going to have your instruction or exhortation. So if you really wanted to study the book of Acts and try to be understanding of what is useful information for my life, that principles for living, it would be those speech acts that you should be looking at. Most of Acts, by far the large chunk of Acts, does not prescribe actions to us. It just describes actions to us. So it's a historical retelling of how the gospel went from Jerusalem to Rome, and that's what it's trying to do for us. So we don't have to pass through Thessalonica and Athens and before we get to someplace else. We just don't have to do that kind of stuff. It's just telling us how these things happen. It's just describing to us how these things happen. The only place where we could pull Christian principles for salvation or behavior or something else would be from the speeches themselves and not from the historical background information. So we need to use Acts responsibly as we do. It is a fantastic source for historical information for the first century, and it's my first source. It's my primary source when I'm doing research for what's going on in that area during the first century itself. So it's a great, great asset for us, but we need to use it properly. Okay, for next week, I'll talk about the Gospels, chapter 7. We will be doing, talking about narratives again. Gospels are narratives also. But they're a little bit different than Acts. They're a little bit different than Old Testament narratives, but they're still narratives. And so we'll talk about the Gospels next week, chapter 7. So I hope that you have a great week this week, the rest of your week, and I'll see you on Sunday. Take care. Bye.